Okay, welcome. In this section, we're going to talk about hub variations. And what we're really talking about here is hub variations considering attribution. Like, what are the attributes that are defined in a hub? So on the first example we're going to look at here, as you can see on the left-hand side, we have a standard hub the way we've been defining it for quite some time. And of course, that includes your customer sequence ID, which is, in our case, of course, the data warehouse key that we use. It's followed by the ensemble key or ensemble identifier, which is our concatenated enterprise-wide view of our what we call the business key. But of course, because we need to create our own with concatenation, that becomes its own thing. After that, of course, we have the load date time, and then we have the record source. And these are the key, well, the primary attributes that we use in modeling a hub. And of course, the sequence ID, the date time stamp, and the record source are the three untouchables that we use in the warehouse, meaning we control them. They're not driven by a business point of view. And of course, that means the ensemble identifier is our interpretation or our concatenation of a business key. In prior videos we've discussed, and it's just a point of reference for now, we don't do a composite key with separate attributes for that ensemble identifier. We like to do a concatenation in case the number of atomic components required to make that composite key changes over time, which it could be it's either extended or it could be reduced depending on your MDM initiatives or something like that. On the right-hand side, you notice a slight variation. On the right-hand side, we're using the word audit ID instead of using record source. And the reason for that is that in most all data warehousing deployments, it's more realistic to just call this some kind of an audit ID, which is really a key that is a way to unlock the information in your load metadata. So whatever it was that defines the job that did the load, right, for you is encapsulated, in this case, in just a key that we can use to go and say, unlock the information of our load metadata. That would include things like the source system where it came from, login credentials if you're pulling the data from like a true source, and then of course maybe the job, the version ID of that job, the date when it was extracted, whatever other metadata is associated with the sourcing of that data from wherever you're getting it from. So an audit ID is just terminology-wise seems to make sense. But now, assuming that's what we've agreed to, let's go on to the next one. You can see something is missing in this next view on the right-hand side. We've transitioned from the standard vault attributes to actually eliminating the load date timestamp for only an audit ID. Now, this was first introduced to me a long time ago. It was probably as much as even 15 years ago in working with a client in the Netherlands. And it came up that, yeah, they weren't using load date timestamp in their hubs. And the reason for that is they wanted to avoid any confusion with people using that, technical data warehouse load date time as part of the key, or assuming that you could make this thing transition in a temporal manner. Of course, hubs are loaded once, and then they are never touched after that. If the key transitions, then of course you load a new hub, and you have a same as link, or you do something else to note the change. But we actually don't swap out the key underneath a hub for a different one. So the date time really has no meaning other than that it represents the first time we ever saw this hub. The first time we saw this entry was on that date. Of course, that kind of load date time of the first time we saw it is already available within the load metadata. Now, that's not exposed to us in a manner that's easy for us to report on, but assuming that it's really not that important to have, meaning it doesn't transition, doesn't change the key, it's probably pretty logical to assume that it's fine if you really want to know the first time that you saw this instance of that record, you can just refer to the load metadata, and the job there would let you know when you first saw it. Interestingly enough, of course, typically, right, there would be a satellite entry to that first load. So the first load date time in whatever your main satellite is associated should also represent the first time that it came in. Certainly, even if it didn't, it's the first time that it became important or apparent to you because it's the first time it had any context. So that would make sense. So that's not a bad way to go. Now, another topic that's come up over the years, of course, is the use of a hash key. And the thing that's important about the use of a hash key, and that's an important thing to point out here, is that when and if you decide to use a hash key, we're really now transitioning to the idea that the hash key is your business ensemble identifier. In other words, whatever the concatenation is that we used to reference the business natural key or the whatever business key you're referring to, even though being concatenated with other components to make it unique enterprise-wide, even though that's true, right, the hash is simply a translation of it, which means that it's really the same thing as having the key be the ensemble identifier. Now, this has been pointed out by people many times. If you're going to use a hash, why not just use the concatenated key anyway, because it's basically one for one. It's the same. The issue, of course, being that if you do that, it changes the paradigm of what we do with the Data Vault Ensemble. I'm going to take a quick look at the board with you on this and see what that means. Okay, so one of the things we were just saying is, what about that hash key, and wouldn't it be convenient to use it? Of course, when you use a hash key, what you're saying is it's now actually using the key itself, right? Because if I have a business key or an ensemble identifier, if I create the hash of it, that means that it's a one-to-one translation that represents the exact same key. Of course, through a common algorithm, whichever hash mechanism you use, it's just a one-for-one path for that to work. So what I would say is that if you think about it, when you have a hash key, it's actually the business key itself, which means you would be taking the business key and placing it in all your satellites and links. Now remember, from unified decomposition, what we're saying is we want to take what was encapsulated with the key relationships and context and split it out. So we have only context, only relationships, and only the key. When you use the hash, what you end up doing is creating the key and placing it in all those components. What's the end result? There's no more unified decomposition. It no longer holds everything together. And that's really the issue with using it. Of course, if you hear people discussing the reasons why, they will say it's great to use the hash because then you can go directly to the satellite, go directly to the link without using the hub. As a matter of fact, you don't even need a hub at all because it's already embedded via the hash key in all the forms. So let's go back to the presentation and finish that out. Okay, so as you can see, what's happened is that the whole premise of ensemble modeling, wherein we use a key dependency to keep that unified decomposition constellation of parts, the way we keep it together and unified, right, is through the key dependency. When we use a hash, what we're saying is we eliminate that key dependency. And again, that's something that's been touted as being an advantage. Hey, we don't have to use the hub. But of course, keep in mind, if this is something you would consider doing, if now the form of that table structure of an ensemble, that key dependency in the database, if it is no longer there, you need to figure out another way to make sure you enforce the consistency and don't end up with silos. Now that's a really important feature because if you don't, you will certainly end up with where we were 20 years ago, where we ended up with a large supply of many dimensions and silos, and they took their own direction and went their own way, had their own lives. That was one of the reasons why, of course, we ended up with issues and still have issues in doing strictly, say, dimensional warehousing with a bunch of many dimensions. So, you know, the whole driver of ensemble is to retain the key dependency for consistency while also having multiple tables, unified decomposition. When you take the key dependency away, you no longer have that enforced benefit. That's all we have for you today. We'll see you in the next video.